3 miles above a world wired for annihilation, a silver of metal cut through air so thin it was closer to space than to Earth. The pilot sat cocooned under a bubble of glass, the curve of the planet bending beneath him, the clouds far below like a second, softer world. His aircraft carried no bombs, no missiles, only cameras and film. Yet on that day, in that sky, this unarmed plane was more dangerous than any weapon on Earth. One wrong turn, one wrong burst of static on a radio, and the age of threats and speeches could have ended in the glare of nuclear fire. The aircraft was the Lockheed U-2, a spy plane built for a simple purpose: see everything. Its impossibly long wings and lightweight frame let it soar above 70,000 feet, so high that the pilot needed a pressure suit just to stay alive. Up here, in the blue-black edge of the stratosphere, the U-2 was almost untouchable. Fighters couldn't reach it. Early missiles struggled to climb this high. For years, it had flown like a phantom over denied territory, slipping across borders, photographing airfields, missile sites, and radar stations, then vanishing back into the protective haze of national denial. But the deeper the Cold War sank into suspicion, the more dangerous that invisibility became. In Washington, maps on secure walls were thick with pins and scribbled notes. The Soviet Union tested missiles, moved divisions, dug new silos. The Pentagon demanded clarity. Where are their launchers? How advanced are their bombers? Are they ahead? Are they behind? Intelligence officers stared at blurry satellite images and partial human reports and decided it wasn't enough. They needed proof. They needed photographs that could be counted, measured, briefed to presidents and generals. Proof that could justify restraint, or if necessary, preemptive action.
So another mission was planned. Another U-2 would rise into the thin air. Another pilot would strap himself into a cockpit with no ejection to safety from politics, no chute to slow his fall from history. He would fly where no American aircraft was meant to be, deep into Soviet airspace, across cities bristling with anti-aircraft guns and newly fielded surface-to-air missiles. For intelligence planners, the risk was acceptable. For the man in the cockpit, the risk was personal. For the rest of the world, the risk was invisible, buried under layers of secrecy and acronyms. The pilot's name was Francis Gary Powers. To his neighbors back home, he was an Air Force veteran turned civilian contractor. To his handlers, he was the tip of an invisible spear. On the morning of his most important mission, the runway beneath his aircraft shimmered with heat. Technicians in coveralls moved like insects around the spindly landing gear, checking fuel lines, oxygen, camera mounts, the fragile skin that separated the pilot from a lethal vacuum of cold. Powers walked toward the U-2 in a bulky pressure suit, helmet under one arm, the way astronauts would walk a few years later. The briefing had been simple in outline, brutal in implication. Take off from a friendly base, climb to operational altitude, cross into Soviet airspace. Follow the plotted track over missile ranges and air bases. Stay above known intercept altitudes. Stay calm. Do not deviate without cause. If something goes wrong, there is no cavalry, only your training and the hope that Soviet radar operators hesitate. Powers had flown many missions before. He knew the routine. He also knew that every new sortie pushed luck a little further. Rumors among pilots suggested the Soviets were improving their missiles. Some believed the U-2's invincibility had an expiration date. But the schedule was made, the cameras calibrated, the order signed in rooms where maps muffled consciences.
The U-2 roared down the runway and leapt awkwardly into the air, its huge wings biting the sky with eager lift. It climbed and climbed, leaving behind the comforting density of normal flight. Soon, Powers was skimming along a thin margin between stall and overspeed, a coffin corner so narrow that any sudden move could rip the wings away or send the aircraft tumbling. The world below turned into abstract geography. Rivers became silver veins, cities became gray smudges, airfields became geometric scars. Somewhere far beneath those smudges were men loading missiles, tuning radars, sifting through their own intelligence about this new intruder that kept appearing on the edges of their screens. To Powers, the cockpit was a world reduced to dials, needles, and the faint hiss of oxygen. Cameras clicked quietly beneath him, their lenses unblinking. Straps pressed against his shoulders. Every switch, every gauge was familiar. Yet there was always the awareness, This was not a training flight over Arizona. This was a knife-edge glide through enemy sky, supported only by metal, physics, and the hope that the other side remained half a step behind in technology. On the ground, Soviet radar operators watched the ascending blip. They had seen intrusions before, dots that appeared, taunted them beyond reach, then slipped away. It was an insult every time, a loud reminder that somewhere beyond the Urals, another power flew with impunity above their homeland. This time, though, something was different. New missiles had been deployed. New orders had been issued. Permission to fire had traveled down the chain with unusual clarity. If the intruder returned, it would not leave unchallenged. As the U-2 crossed deeper into the Soviet interior, the air below was already thick with preparations. Launch crews waited beside canisters of liquid fuel, hands poised over switches. Outside concrete bunkers, missile fins glinted in morning light as covers rattled open. Within command posts, officers listened to overlapping shouts, altitude, bearing, projected track. Some knew that if they brought this aircraft down, they would be heroes.
Others understood something more dangerous, that any engagement risked an international incident of staggering proportions, but pressure ran in one direction, up. The intruder had been tolerated for too long. Action was not just allowed, it was expected. Powers had been briefed on the threat of surface-to-air missiles, but the details were incomplete. Intelligence analysts believed the new Soviet systems could reach higher than older guns and rockets. Still, the working assumption was clear. At U-2 altitudes, interception remained unlikely. The enemy's reach lagged behind the aircraft's climb. That belief was already outdated. Under him, the first missile boosters ignited, cutting white scars into the atmosphere as they leapt toward the thin trail of exhaust, drawing a line through Soviet sky. Alone in his bubble of glass, Powers sensed nothing at first. The U-2's cockpit was insulated from the chaos below. The aircraft hummed steadily, its slim wings flexing subtly with air currents that most planes would never meet. He monitored his instruments, made minor corrections, and followed the invisible path drawn on charts miles away. The world around him seemed too calm to contain danger. That calm was an illusion, stretched thin over a rising storm. On Soviet screens, the distance between missile and target shrank. Operators called out altitude matches, closing angles, expected detonation times. Outside, the missiles arced upward, their guidance systems locking in on altitude and trajectory. Each second carried them closer to a point in the sky currently occupied by one man, and a fragile aircraft built around delicate cameras. The ground commanders had no view of that man's face, no sense of his heartbeat tapping against his ribs. They had coordinates, bearings, orders, and the ingrained habit of obedience. When the first warhead detonated, it did so not with the clean, cinematic flash of fiction, but with violent, unseen physics. A proximity explosion high in the thin atmosphere punched a shockwave through the air.
Shrapnel scattered in all directions, tiny fragments of metal suddenly lethal at supersonic speeds. Powers felt it not as a distant boom, but as a violent lurch. The aircraft shuddering, alarms howling alive, control surfaces snapping into chaos. One wing sheared, the U-2's delicate structural balance breaking in an instant. The nose pitched, the fuselage twisted, and what had been a graceful glider became a tumbling wreck, clawing uselessly at the empty sky. The cockpit exploded into motion. Loose checklists, pens, and dust swirled in a centrifuge as Powers fought to regain control. Training pounded at the front of his mind. Stabilize, diagnose, respond. But there was nothing to stabilize. Needles spun uselessly. Warning lights glowed red like a miniature city in panic. He tried to trigger the self-destruct systems meant to destroy classified equipment if capture were imminent, but the rolling, snapping aircraft turned every reach into a desperate grab. The G-forces built until his vision narrowed, the world darkening at the edges. The ejection system, never entirely reliable at such altitudes and speeds, became his only exit. Harnesses dug into his shoulders as he tried to separate himself from a machine now determined to drag him down. At last, the canopy tore away, the roar of the atmosphere slamming into his suit. The cold bit instantly, a knife-edge frost that would kill him quickly if his systems failed. Then, the aircraft fell away beneath him, disintegrating into pieces that spun through the distant blue below. Powers was alone, suspended between stratosphere and Earth, falling into the center of a geopolitical storm he could not see. As his parachute deployed, the thin air thickened. The ground emerged from abstraction, resolving into real forests, real fields, and soon, real soldiers. The wind carried him toward a patchwork of land firmly under Soviet control. There would be no friendly rescue helicopter, no quick extraction. The moment his boots touched soil, he ceased to be a pilot and became something else. Solid evidence.
News of the lost aircraft reached Washington, wrapped in fragments of radio traffic and uneasy silences. At first, analysts and officials hoped for benign explanations: equipment malfunction, navigational error, anything that suggested Powers had simply disappeared into the wilderness. A cover story was drafted quickly: a weather research aircraft, lost while sampling high-altitude winds, possibly suffering oxygen failure. Publicly, the United States would express concern, promise an investigation, and deny any suggestion of espionage. Secrecy had always been the U-2's shield. If the wreckage were unrecognizable, if no pilot survived, the story might hold. Those calculations shattered as soon as Moscow made its move. In a carefully staged announcement, Soviet leaders revealed that a foreign spy plane had been shot down inside their territory. The Americans, sticking to their script, released the weather plane explanation. They spoke of faulty instruments, tragic accidents, the vastness of the sky. Then the Soviet premier produced the trump card: the pilot. Alive, cameras photographed Powers alongside the twisted remains of his aircraft and the intact cameras that still held compromising images. The U-2 was no longer a rumor traced on radar screens, it was a captured artifact. In that instant, the cover story collapsed. The world watched as one superpower was exposed in a lie, caught red-handed peering into the other's backyard. The timing could not have been worse. A major summit was days away, meant to ease tensions and forge a path toward reduced armaments. Now, instead of cautious optimism, the atmosphere thickened with accusation. The Soviet leader arrived at the talks armed not only with grievances, but with undeniable proof. Trust, already scarce, evaporated. The U-2 incident did more than humiliate. It poisoned the fragile well of negotiation. The notion that both sides could step back from the brink through calm dialogue now had to fight its way through fresh anger. Western leaders found themselves torn between admitting the full extent of their reconnaissance flights and maintaining enough denial to keep other covert programs intact. Domestic audiences, already wary of government secrecy, watched their leaders struggle on television. The Soviet public was fed a narrative of righteous defense against imperial intrusion.
Gary Powers, meanwhile, stood at the center of a stage he had never chosen. In a Soviet courtroom, his mission, training, and loyalties were dissected under the bright lights of propaganda. He became both symbol and pawn, evidence of American aggression, proof of the superiority of Soviet defense, and a useful bargaining chip for future negotiations. Behind the scenes, diplomats worked toward a prisoner exchange. Intelligence agencies weighed his value against that of captured Soviet operatives held in Western prisons. Eventually, the quiet arithmetic of espionage settled on a trade. Powers would go home, and another shadow in the opposite camp would return to its own side. Yet even after the exchange, the damage lingered. Confidence in the safety of manned overflights waned. The era of high-altitude reconnaissance planes operating with near impunity was coming to an end. In its place, a new age of surveillance rose on wings of rocketry and orbital mechanics. Satellites would inherit the hazardous work of peering over borders, and no pilot would sit strapped to their metal skin. The U-2 had not vanished from service, but it had lost the illusion of invincibility. If the story ended there, with one aircraft, one trial, one diplomatic disaster, it would already be a cautionary tale about the razor-thin margin between intelligence gathering and catastrophe. But history is seldom content with a single warning. 2 years later, the same aircraft type would once again drift close to the trigger point of global war, this time not over Soviet fields, but in the swirling chaos of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In October 1962, the world was already holding its breath. Soviet missiles had been discovered in Cuba, their launch pads rising from tropical soil within striking distance of American cities. Warships patrolled tense lines at sea, nuclear bombers stood loaded on runways, underground missiles waited only for codes. Diplomats argued about quarantines and blockades, but the plain truth was simpler. Both sides had maneuvered themselves into a corner. A single miscalculation could ignite a chain of launches and counter-launches from which no one would return.
In this climate, information was everything. Leaders needed to know not just what had been deployed days ago, but what was on the ground that very morning. The U-2, with its unblinking cameras, still offered something no other system could match. Photographs detailed enough to count individual missiles, measure launch pads, and verify whether warheads had arrived. So while fleets circled and speeches thundered, the familiar ritual repeated itself. Pilots climbed into pressure suits, ground crews fueled long-winged aircraft, routes were plotted over places where any accident could be mistaken for an attack. One such route led far from Cuba, to the edge of the Arctic, where a different U-2 mission prepared to sample the upper atmosphere for signs of recent nuclear tests. The pilot, flying at extraordinary altitude, navigated by instruments, celestial cues, and radio beacons. But the far north placed tricks on human senses and human tools alike. That day, the sky erupted in shimmering curtains of green and purple, the aurora borealis, beautiful, silent, and electrically disruptive. Radios crackled and failed, navigation aids flickered, the boundaries between friendly and hostile airspace blurred on the pilot's charts as he tried to reconcile conflicting bearings. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the aircraft drifted off course. What began as a minor deviation became a slow slide toward forbidden ground. The U-2, oblivious to the human lines drawn on maps below, continued its steady march. The pilot, isolated and struggling with faulty readings, fought to correct a problem he could not fully see. Beneath him, the ice and tundra of the Soviet North unfolded like a vast, unforgiving plain. Eventually, the aircraft pushed past the invisible line. The spy plane was once again in Soviet skies, this time not over test ranges in peacetime, but during the most dangerous standoff in human history.
Soviet radar operators, already on the highest alert, watched the new intrusion with alarm. In the context of the Cuban crisis, any unexpected aircraft crossing their borders could be seen as a prelude, a probe, even the first step of a nuclear strike. Soviet fighters scrambled, engines flaring in the freezing air as they climbed to intercept. From their perspective, this was not an accident at all. It was a hostile platform, emerging from the north, the same direction from which American bombers would come in time of war. Back on the American side, controllers realized with dawning horror what had happened. Tracking stations reported the U-2's drifting position, each update worse than the last. It was now well inside Soviet territory, and Soviet fighters were on the move. To protect the pilot, and to prevent him from being shot down and captured, like Powers, American interceptors launched as well. Some of these U.S. aircraft carried a terrible kind of insurance, nuclear-tipped air-to-air missiles, designed to obliterate enemy bomber formations in a single searing blast. For a brief, sickening window of time, the pieces were set for catastrophe. In the Arctic sky, one unarmed aircraft, lost and disoriented, tried to find its way home. Hunting it from one side were conventional Soviet fighters, guided by radar and anger. Racing to intersect from another direction were American interceptors whose armament, if used, could be mistaken by radar and early warning systems as the opening salvo of an all-out nuclear exchange. Officers on both sides watched their screens, each man interpreting the same scattered data through rival fears. Inside the lost U-2, the pilot wrestled with conflicting signals. Compasses behaved erratically near the magnetic pole. Radio communications cut in and out, adding confusion instead of clarity. He was high, alone, and acutely aware that every additional minute over hostile territory increased the chances of interception, or worse, misinterpretation. If he was shot down now, it would not be a singular embarrassment between superpowers. It could be seen as an act of aggression in the middle of a standoff already calibrated for immediate response.
Back in command centers, decisions had to be made in minutes, sometimes seconds. Should the American escorts move closer, risking contact with Soviet aircraft and turning a tense chase into an armed engagement? Should they hang back and hope the U-2 could claw its way back across an invisible line before someone on the other side pulled a trigger? Every option carried the seed of disaster. In the end, survival hinged less on grand strategy than on restraint and luck. Soviet pilots, though aggressive, never achieved a clean shot at the intruder before it began turning away. American commanders, recognizing the mounting risk, held tight control over their nuclear-armed interceptors, refusing to let the moment escalate into a dogfight. The lost pilot, piecing together flickering readings and partial guidance, finally steered the U-2 back toward friendly territory. What could have been remembered as the opening act of World War III became instead a near-forgotten footnote, buried in classified after-action reports and nervous jokes. Later, when the world exhaled after the Cuban Missile Crisis, a handful of insiders would look back on that Arctic incident with a chill that had nothing to do with the polar air. It was a reminder that in a world wired for automatic retaliation, war did not need an order. It only needed a misunderstanding, a navigational error, a corrupted signal from an aurora, a missile launch misread as a larger strike. Any of these could have kicked loose the fragile mechanisms holding back catastrophe. The U-2 lived on after these crises, its silhouette still tracing long shadows over distant landscapes. New versions were built, with better sensors and more robust defenses, yet its legend had changed. No longer just a symbol of ingenuity and technical daring, it had become an emblem of risk, the kind of risk that hides in the gray zone between knowing too little and needing to know everything. For both the Powers shoot-down and the Arctic near disaster, the aircraft was the same: thin wings, long fuselage, and eye turned downward. What changed was the context, the temperature of diplomacy, the volatility of men watching radar screens in concrete bunkers.
As the decades passed, some of the story slipped from public awareness. New crises erupted in new places, inspired by new technologies. Satellites replaced film canisters. Digital sensors replaced silver halide. Intelligence was now more often a product of algorithms than pilots' nerves. But among those who study the Cold War's narrow escapes, the U-2 retains a special, uneasy place. It was a machine that made secrets visible, and in doing so, brought the world closer to seeing its own destruction. For the men who flew it, the memories never softened completely. They remembered the feeling of lifting off into a sky that thinned too quickly, of watching the world flatten into something that looked almost peaceful from above. They remembered the weight of mission briefings that glossed over danger with arrows on a map. Some would talk quietly, years later, about how easy it was to forget the stakes at altitude, until a gauge flickered, a radar warning lit up, or an unexpected radio call broke the hush. Others never spoke publicly at all, carrying their experiences like classified documents locked in the vault of their own minds. In museums, retired U-2s now sit quiet under controlled light. Visitors walk around them, read placards, and marvel at how fragile and narrow the wings appear up close. Children peer into cockpits that once floated high above hostile terrain. The metal is cool, inert, stripped of camera units and fuel. It is hard, standing there, on polished floors, to imagine the aircraft shaking apart under missile blasts or drifting lost through auroral skies while two nuclear-armed superpowers watch suspiciously from opposite horizons. Yet that is what happened. Once a plane like this fell burning into Soviet fields, dragging a summit and a fragile hope for detente with it. Once another almost blundered into history's darkest chapter, its course bent by invisible lights in the upper atmosphere. In both cases, the world stepped back from the edge, not out of wisdom alone, but because chance and a few steady hands intervened. The U-2's missions were always about seeing more clearly, counting warheads, measuring runways, reading the intentions of an enemy from the angle of its launch pads. Ironically, these same flights sometimes pushed everyone closer to a moment when sight would no longer matter at all.
The story of the U-2 spy plane mission that almost started World War III is not just the tale of a single sortie or a single pilot. It is the story of how fragile peace can be when preserved by systems built for war, how the line between vigilance and provocation can blur at 30,000, 50,000, 70,000 feet. It is the story of tiny variables, solar storms, misread dials, ambiguous blips on a radar stacking against a background of vast arsenals in rigid doctrines. In the end, the world did not burn because of that lost aircraft over the Arctic, just as it did not burn the day Powers fell from the sky. But both events left marks. They altered how leaders thought about risk, how intelligence was gathered, how tightly reconnaissance would be tied to diplomacy. They fed into the unspoken understanding that grew in shadows on both sides of the Iron Curtain. If survival depended on flawless machines and infallible men, no one would survive for long. High above the Earth today, new generations of reconnaissance platforms drift along precise orbits. They see everything in the silence of space, immune to auroral distortion and far beyond the reach of S-75 missiles. Down below, most people will never know their names or care about their missions. The world they watch is still dangerous, but the particular terror of a single pilot lost in enemy skies has faded. Still, when historians trace the thin, flickering line that separates the tense peace of the Cold War from the unthinkable alternative, they often pause where a narrow-winged aircraft once flew. They pause where a camera replaced a bomb, but the risk remained. They pause where the sky, for a few terrifying minutes, became a place where a navigational error could rewrite history. On those days, the U-2 was not just a spy plane.
It was a question hurled into the upper air. How close can we fly to the edge of disaster and still come home? The answer, as the world discovered, was far closer than anyone should ever dare.